You probably think the traditional 9-to-5 schedule came from the Industrial Revolution, conceived by clever Victorian gentlemen in waistcoats, calculating the perfect number of working hours before employees started dying. But no, it came from monks. Back in the Middle Ages, monks were practically the only people organized enough to keep track of time, and perhaps a little irritating in their insistence that everyone else adhere to it. Their lives ran on a sacred, never-ending cycle dictated by bells. Morning bells, midday bells, bells for prayer, bells for meals, and bells for regretting the decision to become a monk. It was less of a spiritual quest and more like a divinely ordained alarm system, complete with added guilt. So, the next time your alarm blares at 7 a.m. and you drag yourself to another day of labor in exchange for rent and nagging back pain, remember, you're not modern, you're medieval. Welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into exactly that, the medieval mindset that subtly shapes our lives even now. Before we continue this slightly ridiculous journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the Quiet History for Deep Sleep channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I create. And I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a gentle background hum, and let's ease back into the monastery. The monastic day was structured around what were known as canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These sound less like prayer times and more like spells rejected from the Harry Potter series. At every interval, monks would cease their activities to chant, kneel, or simply gaze blankly into the void. Efficiency wasn't the goal, obedience was. You weren't supposed to think. You were supposed to synchronize with God, the abbey, and whoever was in charge of the bell tower, including that one monk who rang it 2 minutes early just to watch the world burn. Over the centuries, the world outside caught the contagion. Towns scheduled their markets by church bells, guilds used them to mark work hours, and eventually factories copied the system wholesale, minus the praying, plus screaming managers. When the Industrial Revolution rolled in, someone basically said, let's take the monastic routine, remove the faith, and add paperwork. And thus the modern workday was born. The monks at least got silence, wine, and a robe that doubled as pajamas. You get fluorescent lights and Slack notifications. Even your lunch break has roots in monastic timekeeping, specifically the sext hour, when monks paused to pray and maybe sneak in a snack before continuing their divine spreadsheets. The 9-to-5 didn't evolve. It escaped the monastery, put on a suit, and learned to say, let's circle back on that. If you've ever sneezed in public and someone muttered, bless you, congratulations, you've participated in one of humanity's oldest and silliest reflexes. It's not politeness. It's a lingering medieval panic that never received the memo about germ theory. Back in the 6th century, when the plague was touring Europe, sneezing was far from a minor inconvenience. It was considered a dire omen. A single sneeze was enough for people to assume you were infected. 2 sneezes, and they'd start dividing up your belongings. The logic was simple. When you sneezed, your soul attempted to escape through your nose, and the devil, ever present, might seize the chance to snatch it mid-air. Enter Pope Gregory the Great, who in 590 CE decreed that every sneeze required divine intervention. He instructed the faithful to respond with, God bless you, effectively transforming respiratory function into a team sport. Each bless you served as an emergency prayer, a miniature exorcism for those afflicted with hay fever. The phrase spread like wildfire, even faster than the plague itself. Soon, every village in Europe was collectively blessing each other into utter exhaustion. No one could sneeze in peace. Imagine the soundscape: church bells, roosters, and 40 villagers shouting, "God bless you," every time someone inhaled pollen. And it worked. Not medically, but socially. Saying, "bless you," became a way of proving you weren't the kind of monster who would let their neighbor die unblessed. Refusing to say it was practically witchcraft. The superstition persisted. Even after centuries of scientific advancements, hygiene practices, and vaccines, we still bless sneezers as if it were 1,348. No one believes their souls are escaping anymore. But we still instinctively panic at the sound of nasal explosions. Meanwhile, the only thing truly escaping during a sneeze is a cloud of 100,000 bacteria droplets traveling at 100 miles per hour directly towards your face. And no one blesses you for that. So, next time someone sneezes and you instinctively mumble, "bless you," just remember, you're reenacting a medieval ritual designed to keep Satan out of someone's sinuses. You're not being polite. You're participating in a 1,000-year-old mass delusion. And somehow, it's still considered good manners. The next time you twirl spaghetti or politely stab a piece of chicken, remember that in medieval Europe, that simple act could have branded you a heretic. Yes, the fork, that innocent utensil in your cutlery drawer, was once considered a tool of Satan. It arrived in Western Europe around the 11th century, brought by wealthy Byzantine nobles who used small golden versions to eat delicate portions without getting their hands dirty. Logical, right? Wrong. The church immediately threw a fit. Clergymen declared that using a fork was an insult to God because, according to them, the Almighty had already provided the perfect eating tools: fingers. The idea that someone might prefer metal over flesh apparently bordered on blasphemy. One famous case involved a Byzantine princess who married into the Venetian royal family. She brought her gold forks with her, and the local priests collectively lost their minds. When she died of the plague shortly after, the clergy smugly declared her death divine punishment for daring to use a shiny, pronged stick instead of her God-given digits. For centuries, Europeans continued to eat with their hands like cavemen in fancy clothes. Even Renaissance nobles hesitated to use forks, considering them unnatural. Knives and spoons were acceptable, one stabbed, one scooped, both sufficiently biblical. But the fork had unsettling vibes. Ironically, people also began dying of foodborne illnesses because, shockingly, unwashed fingers aren't particularly hygienic. But no amount of dysentery could outweigh the church's logic. God made hands, therefore, use them. It wasn't until the 17th century, when Italy's fashionable elite decided forks were chic, that the rest of Europe relented. And, as always, the English were the last to join, deeming forks effeminate until someone important used one in public. So, next time you sit at a table and politely twirl your pasta, know this: you're performing an act that was once seen as morally questionable. The medieval church fought against sanitation, elegance, and table decorum, and lost. In a poetic way, every dinner involving cutlery represents a small victory for common sense over organized superstition, or, as the priests might have called it, temptation served on silver. If you think bachelor parties today are chaotic, imagine them with swords. In the Middle Ages, before marriage was about love or shared Netflix accounts, it was a financial transaction. But even back then, men couldn't resist one last night of questionable decisions before signing their lives away. Thus was born the medieval stag night, the original bachelor party. Knights would gather in taverns or manors, drink ale until their helmets no longer fit, gamble away their horses, and loudly proclaim eternal devotion to freedom, which usually lasted about 8 hours. These celebrations were supposedly meant to honor the groom's transition into responsibility. In practice, they were an excuse to see how much mead a man could consume before collapsing into a moat. The stag symbolized virility and wildness. Medieval code for drunken regret. Guests would toast the groom's bravery for entering matrimony while secretly placing bets on how long he would survive domestic life. Someone would inevitably challenge another to a duel, and at least one man would mistake the bride's cousin for a barmaid. The church naturally despised these parties. Priests labeled them feasts of sin, which, to be fair, was rather accurate. They warned that premarital drunkenness led to damnation. The knights, of course, saw this as a challenge. Over time, the tradition trickled down from nobles to townsmen, who replaced castles with taverns and armor with leather shoes. But the spirit remained. Eat, drink, and behave terribly, because tomorrow you're legally obligated to behave otherwise. Even the morning after rituals were familiar. Hangovers, awkward silences, and promises never to speak of what happened. The only real difference between then and now is that medieval men didn't have smartphones to record the evidence. So, when you see a modern groom stumbling out of a bar wearing a plastic crown and an expression of pure regret, you're witnessing history. It's the same tradition, just without the swords, the plague, and the moral authority of a guy named Sir Geoffrey trying to juggle flaming torches while proclaiming his undying love for something. Bachelor parties didn't evolve. They just downgraded from chainmail to matching t-shirts. And somewhere, a medieval monk is still praying for all of them. When someone dies today, we instinctively dress in black. It feels respectful, somber, even timeless. But the truth is, it's simply a medieval fashion trend that spiraled out of control. The color of mourning used to vary by region. The Romans wore white to funerals, clean, symbolic, and ideal for reflecting sunlight while mourning under the Italian sun. But medieval Europe looked at that and said, "No, let's make grief depressing and stylish." Black dye was expensive in the Middle Ages, meaning only the wealthy could afford to look properly devastated. Peasants, naturally, couldn't afford sorrow in fabric form, so they wore whatever was clean, which, statistically, was not much. The nobles, however, turned mourning into an elaborate event. Draped in black wool and veils, they wailed theatrically through the streets because grief, like everything else, had to be performative. The church loved it. Black symbolized humility before God, and conveniently, it made the clergy's wardrobe choices appear pious rather than lazy. Over time, the color of mourning spread to every social class, because nothing says repentance like wearing something that absorbs both heat and despair. By the 14th century, black funerals were the ultimate power move. Kings died in black, widows lived in black, entire courts spent years in coordinated sadness. Queen Victoria later revived the custom, remaining in mourning black for 40 years, a record-breaking emotional hostage situation. Of course, the color eventually lost its religious significance and simply stuck. Now, we all show up to funerals dressed like accountants who have misfiled eternity because the Middle Ages decided grief needed a dress code. Ironically, the rest of the world didn't follow suit. In much of Asia, mourners still wear white, the color of purity. In Africa, bright colors symbolize a life well lived. Meanwhile, in the West, we prefer to resemble a collective tax audit for the deceased. So, next time you attend a funeral in black, remember, you're not channeling timeless reverence, you're just following a 1,000-year-old medieval fashion rule, invented by rich people trying to appear holier than everyone else. And as with all fashion trends, it's never really been about the dead. It's about proving you cared more stylishly than everyone else. Ah, the handshake. That sacred gesture of modern civility, professionalism, and the occasional bacterial exchange. It seems polite, friendly, even human. But its origins are, like those of most medieval customs, deeply suspicious. In the Middle Ages, people didn't shake hands to say hello. They did it to say, "Please, don't murder me." Medieval Europe was a paranoid place. Everyone carried weapons, everyone owed someone else a debt, and everyone's cousin was plotting a coup. So, when two men met, they would extend their right hands to prove they weren't concealing a dagger. The shaking part came later. A little theatrical jiggle to ensure no knife was hidden up the sleeve. It was less a greeting and more a mutual weapons inspection. Knights, merchants, and even kings used it, though usually with a sword hand trembling from the effort of feigning trust. And of course, the left-handed minority, eternally under suspicion, were deemed untrustworthy simply because their sword was on the other side. Medieval logic, flawless, as always. By the 16th century, the handshake had evolved into a formal greeting among gentlemen, replacing bows and the ever-popular awkward silence. It became a symbol of equality, a way of saying, we are both free men, capable of stabbing each other, but choosing not to. Fast forward a few centuries, and the handshake somehow became professional. Businessmen transformed it from a survival tactic into a networking ritual. The same gesture once used to ensure neither party was hiding a blade now seals multi-million-dollar deals, which, let's be honest, are just the modern equivalent of jewels, only slower and with more lawyers. Even the pandemic couldn't kill it. Doctors warned us to stop shaking hands, and humanity collectively said, no, we'd rather risk plague than appear rude. A very medieval mindset, really. So, the next time someone grips your hand too tightly at a meeting, remember what they're really saying. I come in peace, for now. The handshake isn't a symbol of trust. It's a fossil from an age when trust could get you stabbed. And given how business still works, perhaps it hasn't changed that much after all. If you've ever been told to chew with your mouth closed, don't talk while eating, or stop licking the knife, congratulations. You're practicing ancient survival techniques invented by medieval people who grew tired of dying during dinner. You see, table manners didn't originate because someone wanted to appear elegant. They started because medieval dining was horrifying. Picture a long wooden table covered in greasy trenchers, essentially edible plates made of stale bread, with everyone sharing the same knife, the same bowl, and the same fingers. You didn't have your own utensils. You had hope. Napkins were also non-existent. The standard etiquette involved wiping your hands on the nearest dog or neighbor. Monks complained about guests wiping greasy fingers on scripture. And yes, there were rules against spitting on the table, which implies someone had to invent that rule the hard way. By the 13th century, disgust finally evolved into etiquette. Manuals began circulating, books like Time's The Book of the Civilized Man *, which instructed you not to scratch yourself while eating, blow your nose on the tablecloth, or examine your teeth with your knife. These were actual instructions, meaning they weren't obvious at the time. The upper class quickly turned hygiene into hierarchy. Peasants could eat with their hands, but nobles used manners to assert superiority, a sort of social fencing match using spoons instead of swords. Eventually, manners became moral. The church decided that proper behavior at the table reflected a clean soul, because nothing says holiness like daintily slurping soup while believing in witchcraft. By the Renaissance, dining had transformed from survival to performance. Banquets were less about eating and more about demonstrating that you weren't a barbarian. It was Instagram culture, but with trenchers. And yet, those same medieval rules persist. Don't burp, don't pick, don't shout. You're not doing them to appear polite. You're doing them because in an alternate timeline, failing to do them could result in dysentery. You probably think the weekend was a modern invention, a triumph of labor unions, productivity science, or enlightened bosses who valued rest. Nope, it was invented by medieval peasants who wanted to stop working long enough to drink, pray, and occasionally remember what sunlight looked like. In the Middle Ages, there was no concept of a weekend. You worked until your body broke, then you worked slightly more. But the Church, in its infinite mercy, decided people should occasionally rest, not for health reasons, of course, but to attend Mass and avoid sinning unsupervised. The church calendar was packed with feast days, sometimes up to 100 per year. These were religious holidays honoring obscure saints, the Virgin Mary, and occasionally events that sounded suspiciously like excuses for parties. Each feast day meant a day off work, free food, and the legal right to drink before noon. The nobility complained that peasants had too many holidays. One medieval bishop famously grumbled that the people work one day and rest 3. It's possibly the first recorded instance of a manager complaining about employee productivity. As the centuries passed, the Reformation trimmed the fat, literally canceling dozens of saint days for being excessively enjoyable. The Puritans, in particular, were horrified that people enjoyed resting, so they pushed for a stricter system, one mandatory day of rest, Sunday, which is how the Lord's Day slowly transformed into your modern lazy day. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Factory owners noticed that overworked, miserable laborers kept breaking things, including themselves, so they reluctantly reintroduced rest days. Saturday afternoons were added later when someone realized that workers who weren't exhausted made fewer mistakes, like falling into machinery. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend had become official. 1 day for God, 1 day for hangovers. So, next time you collapse into bed on a Saturday night, remember that you're enjoying a tradition born from medieval religion, refined by Protestant guilt and perfected by capitalism's need to make you love Monday again. The weekend wasn't bestowed upon humanity out of kindness. It was a holy compromise between sin, survival, and scheduling. And somehow, we're still thanking God for it. When you slide on a wedding ring today, you're not just declaring eternal love, you're reenacting a medieval property exchange. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It was an economic transaction with decorative vows. Love came after the paperwork, usually followed by regret and joint land management. The ring wasn't a symbol of devotion, it was a receipt. The origin of the ring dates back to ancient Egypt, where circular bands symbolized eternity. The idea traveled through Rome, where men gave rings to women as proof of ownership. By the time it reached medieval Europe, the Church realized this was excellent PR, a symbol of faithfulness that doubled as a legal shackle. The ring was placed on the 4th finger of the left hand because people believed a vein of love, the Times Vena Amoris asterisk, ran directly to the heart. This was utter nonsense. Medieval science also believed headaches stemmed from demons and that leeches possessed medical degrees. But the myth persisted, largely because it sounded poetic enough to justify the expense of gold. Weddings themselves were barely religious until the Church got involved. Before that, it was common law. You said, "I do," in front of witnesses, shook hands, and boom, legally married. The Church saw a business opportunity. Soon, only unions blessed by clergy were valid, and rings became mandatory props. And make no mistake, those early rings were rarely worn by men. For centuries, the ring was a one-way symbol, A woman's visible sign of possession, not partnership. Husbands didn't start wearing them until the 20th century, when World War II soldiers began sporting rings to remember their wives or remind everyone they were taken, even overseas. Now, the wedding ring is ubiquitous. A tiny halo of metal that supposedly represents love, trust, and eternity, until someone leaves it on the bathroom sink. So, when you glance at that band of gold, remember its true meaning. Not eternal romance, not divine blessing, but a medieval merger agreement that has survived every cultural upheaval since the Crusades. You're not wearing a symbol of love. You're wearing a 900-year-old contract with better branding. In the Middle Ages, the average person's home made a modern studio apartment look like Versailles. Walls were optional, doors were overrated, and privacy was a myth. Most people lived in single-room houses shared with family, animals, and whatever spirits haunted the rafters. The medieval concept of personal space was, please stop stepping on the chicken. But then came fabric, that miraculous technology capable of concealing things without constructing new walls. Curtains began as practical objects, heavy drapes designed to keep out drafts, flies, and nosy neighbors. But soon, they evolved into social statements. Nobles began hanging thick, embroidered curtains around their beds, not just for warmth, but for dignity. These bed hangings were like portable bedrooms, creating the illusion of privacy in a hall filled with servants, snoring relatives, and the occasional bard. If you were wealthy enough, your bed had curtains so magnificent they could double as stage sets. Some even had inner curtains for privacy from your own spouse. Apparently, guests slept in the same room, sometimes even the same bed. So, if you wanted to change clothes, pray, or cry dramatically, curtains were your only line of defense. Peasants eventually caught on, using whatever rags they could find to partition their homes. Hanging a blanket between you and the pigsty suddenly felt luxurious. Curtains became the medieval equivalent of noise-canceling headphones, mostly symbolic, mildly effective. Over time, the concept spread. Privacy became a social aspiration. By the Renaissance, curtains were everywhere, on beds, walls, windows, and egos. The wealthier you were, the thicker your drapes. And centuries later, we still do it. We draw our curtains at night as if hiding from the Inquisition, not the neighbor's porch light. We buy blackout curtains, thermal curtains, and privacy shears. Proof that we've upgraded the fabric, but not the paranoia. So, next time you close your curtains before bed, remember that you're reenacting a medieval ritual to protect yourself from judgment, gossip, and cold air. The only real difference is that your neighbors probably aren't watching. Probably. When you hear, "God Save the King," you probably think of national pride, a dignified anthem sung by loyal citizens. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't about patriotism at all. It was an exorcism. The phrase originated as a protective prayer, a kind of spiritual insurance policy for monarchs who had the life expectancy of a ham sandwich at a jousting tournament. Medieval people firmly believed that kings were chosen by God, but also that Satan had terrible boundary issues. Every rebellion, plague, or bad harvest was blamed on demonic interference. So, God Save the King wasn't a cheer. It was crisis management. Whenever a ruler fell ill or someone sneezed near the throne, the church organized public prayers to ward off evil. Entire crowds would chant, "God Save the King," as if it were a magic spell, because, in their minds, it was. The logic went something like this. If enough peasants shouted the phrase loudly enough, God might hear them over the screams of the dying. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Medieval kings still died, mostly from poisoning, warfare, or other kings. But people kept chanting because Superstition is the one political tradition humanity never abandons. By the 16th century, the phrase had become ceremonial. It appeared in church services, royal processions, and desperate attempts to appear loyal. Saying it out loud proved you weren't plotting treason, or at least not today. In a time when bad-mouthing the crown could get you executed, God Save the King was less about faith and more about self-preservation. The song version came much later, during the 18th century, when England transformed this medieval emergency chant into a national anthem. What began as "Please don't let the devil kill our monarch" became "Please don't let France do it instead." And here we are, centuries later, still singing it with hands on hearts, pretending it's about unity when, historically, it was just crowd-sourced holy water. So, the next time you hear a stadium full of people belting out "God Save the King," remember that you're witnessing a medieval ghost ritual, only now it's televised. The idea of a day of rest sounds humane, perhaps even progressive, but the church didn't dream up the idea of Sunday rest to protect your work-life balance. Oh no, its primary aim was far simpler: ensuring you didn't skip Mass. In the early medieval period, the church essentially ran the show. It dictated your calendar, policed your conscience, and even held sway over your prospects in the afterlife. So, it declared Sunday a sacred day of rest, not out of concern for overworked peasants, mind you, but because the priests needed a captive audience. If you were caught toiling away on a Sunday, you weren't merely in violation of labor laws, you were directly offending God. This wasn't just a minor infraction for the HR department. It was a ticket to eternal damnation. Imagine having to explain that in confession. "Forgive me, Father, for I weeded my garden during Vespers." The rules were crystal clear. No plowing, no weaving, no blacksmithing, and absolutely no selling of goods. Unless, of course, the church itself wanted to sell indulgences. That was perfectly acceptable, miraculously so. Sermons warned that anyone who dared to ignore the Lord's Day risked divine punishment. And because medieval Europeans had a particular fondness for gruesome tales, there were plenty to go around. One legend recounted the story of a man who attempted to bake bread on a Sunday, only to see the dough transform into slithering snakes. Another told of a farmer who sharpened his scythe and promptly dropped dead. The moral of the story? God had very strong opinions about your weekend hobbies. Naturally, the enforcement of these rules was rather inconsistent. Lords and nobles still worked whenever they pleased because divine law, much like modern policy, conveniently didn't apply to those in positions of power. Meanwhile, the peasants were threatened with eternal hellfire for simply trying to survive. When the industrial age rolled around, people rediscovered the Sunday rule and rebranded it as family time. Employers hailed it as morally sound, while workers considered it barely enough. And despite 1,000 years of societal progress, the underlying logic remained distinctly medieval. You rest not because you deserve it, but because someone holier, richer, or louder than you said so. Today, most of us spend our Sundays resting by engaging in unpaid labor, running errands, and fretting about Monday. It's not exactly holy, but it is deeply traditional. So, the next time you feel a pang of guilt for checking your email on a Sunday, relax. You're not defying God. You're merely honoring the medieval legacy of working when you're technically not supposed to. And if your boss dares to question you about it, just tell them your dough spontaneously turned into snakes. When someone addresses you as sir or madam, it feels polite, even respectful. But back in the Middle Ages, those words didn't convey respect. They were a stark acknowledgement that the person you were addressing had the legal power to have you executed. Titles of address were essentially the linguistic armor of feudal Europe, a society structured like a human pyramid with kings at the top, peasants at the bottom, and everyone else somewhere in between being crushed. Calling someone Sir, short for sire, from the old French seigneur, was how you acknowledged their ownership of your land, your livelihood, and potentially your very spine. It wasn't optional either. If you encountered a noble and forgot to bow or failed to use their proper title, it wasn't merely a social faux pas. It was a punishable crime. Etiquette manuals from the 14th century explicitly warned that a person of low status must address their betters with reverence, under threat of correction, medieval euphemism for public humiliation, and a good thrashing. Women had their own version, Madame, short for Madame, literally meaning my lady. This wasn't a term of endearment. It was a statement of ownership, signaling that this woman belonged to a social class above yours, usually because she belonged to an actual man above yours. Over time, these titles softened. The nobles lost their fiefdoms, and Sir and Madam trickled down the social hierarchy until they became somewhat meaningless courtesies. Today, we use them for cashiers, customers, and people who block the grocery aisle, small verbal nods to a social order that technically no longer exists, but emotionally still lingers. Americans use them to sound polite. The British use them to sound superior. And in the American South, Sir and Madam can convey anything from genuine respect to the verbal equivalent of a slap, depending entirely on tone. It's linguistic evolution in action. Feudal submission repackaged as customer service. So, the next time someone calls you Sir or Madam, remember that you've just been addressed as though you were a medieval landlord. You didn't earn that authority. You inherited the vocabulary. And when you say it to someone else, you're not necessarily being polite. You're just reenacting feudalism with better manners and worse tips. If you've ever waited in line for a permit, signed a form that needed 3 other signatures, or emailed someone just to circle back, you owe that particular experience to the Middle Ages. Bureaucracy, humanity's favorite way to appear organized while accomplishing absolutely nothing, was a medieval invention. Back then, kings couldn't govern their kingdom single-handedly. They needed literate individuals who could record who owed taxes, who owned land, and who had recently been executed. Thus, the first clerks appeared, men in robes, wielding quills and ink, possessing a supernatural talent for making small problems take an eternity to resolve. The Church perfected this art. Every tithe, sin, confession, and miracle had to be meticulously recorded, stamped, and filed in triplicate. Medieval monasteries were essentially the original offices, candlelit cubicles filled with unpaid interns, known as novices, whose handwriting was exquisite but whose morale was decidedly not. By the 12th century, royal administrations joined the fray. England's kings employed armies of scribes to document every cow, fence, and human soul within the realm. The result was the Domesday Book, history's first comprehensive database, although slightly less searchable than its modern counterparts. It was intended to bring order to the kingdom, but mostly succeeded in organizing confusion. Soon, every government in Europe copied the idea. If something existed, it required a form. Property disputes spawned scrolls longer than wedding ceremonies. Births, deaths, and taxes all demanded signatures, seals, and witnesses. Losing your paperwork was practically an act of treason. The true genius of medieval bureaucracy lay in its ability to create work for itself. For every law, you needed a record. For every record, a clerk. And for every clerk, another clerk to verify the first one's handwriting. It was a perfectly self-sustaining ecosystem, a paper-based perpetual motion machine powered entirely by frustration. Fast forward to the modern world, and remarkably, little has changed. We've swapped parchment for PDFs, quills for keyboards, and seals for email signatures, but the underlying spirit remains the same. You still need permission to do things that no one truly understands. So, the next time you're stuck on hold or filling out a form that asks for the same information 5 times, take solace in knowing that you're participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition. Medieval kings had scrolls. You have spreadsheets. Both are equally meaningless, but at least yours has a submit button. If you think outrage culture was invented on Twitter, you clearly haven't encountered a medieval villager with too much time on their hands and access to a church bell. The Middle Ages thrived on moral panic. There was no 24-hour news cycle, no trending topics, just priests, rumors, and the occasional goat behaving suspiciously. One person spotted a comet, another blamed the local widow for it, and suddenly half the town was ablaze. Back then, society didn't require evidence. It needed someone to blame. Drought? Witches. Illness? Witches. Bread failed to rise? Definitely witches. It was a one-size-fits-all explanation for everything that went wrong. And if no witches were conveniently available, heretics or foreigners would do just as nicely. The church fueled this frenzy with remarkable efficiency. Panic was good for attendance. If you could convince people that sin caused plagues and heresy caused earthquakes, they'd be far more inclined to tithe generously. Call it medieval crowdfunding for divine protection. Inquisitors traveled from town to town, purging corruption, which mostly involved asking leading questions until someone confessed to dancing with the devil. Public hysteria served as entertainment, too. Witch trials were community events. People brought snacks. The same individuals who cheered at executions would spend the following morning fervently praying for mercy, a perfect balance of guilt and spectacle. And let's be honest, not much has truly changed. We've simply replaced the gallows with comment sections and the torches with Wi-Fi. Someone makes a mistake, everyone piles on, and by sunset, there's a cacophony of digital shouting, moral grandstanding, and zero actual solutions. The rhythm remains the same, just with slightly better spelling. Medieval panic maintained order through fear. Modern panic sustains engagement through algorithms. Both leave you feeling self-righteous while accomplishing absolutely nothing. It's a tradition so resilient that it has survived plagues, printing presses, and the Enlightenment, and still thrives every time someone proclaims, "I can't believe you'd post that." Renaissance Rome was intended to be the vibrant heart of holiness, a city where saints prayed, pilgrims wept, and divine light permeated every corner. But if you peeled back the gilded facade of marble and frescoes, you'd uncover something entirely different, a place where desire held sway as powerfully as faith. The same bells that summoned the faithful to Mass also tolled over a city intoxicated by its own vices. By the early 1500s, the Holy City was a paradox. Pilgrims arrived, seeking salvation, yet the streets reeked of perfume and wine. The taverns surrounding Piazza Navona teemed with priests who had clearly forgotten their vows of chastity and possibly sobriety. Noblemen strutted about in velvet doublets, while courtesans leaned from their balconies, their laughter echoing as the church bells rang. Even confession, intended to cleanse the soul, had devolved into an erotic ritual whispered behind latticed screens. Everywhere you looked, temptation was being sponsored by the very institutions meant to suppress it. Monks dabbled in alchemy, spending more time brewing aphrodisiacal potions than copying scripture. Nuns exchanged love letters, concealed within the pages of psalters. Bishops hosted banquets that would have made the pagan emperors blush, complete with roasted peacock, dancing girls, and an endless flow of wine. And at the very center of it all stood the Vatican itself, the fortress of morality, or so it claimed. The papal palace was draped in virtue by day, but at night its corridors flickered with candlelight and laughter. Servants swore they witnessed mistresses slipping through secret doors, and rumors spread of cardinals fathering more children than they could possibly count. Rome, the city of saints, had transformed itself into a Renaissance version of Las Vegas. If Las Vegas charged indulgences and quoted scripture while doing it. Yet, remarkably, no one seemed truly scandalized. Hypocrisy had become an art form. A priest might preach about lust in the morning, visit his mistress in the afternoon, and commission a painting of the Virgin Mary that suspiciously resembled her by evening. It was an era where holiness was worn like jewelry, sparkling in the light but tarnished in the dark. Rome called itself the Eternal City, but at the peak of the Renaissance, the Vatican resembled less a monastery and more a royal court, complete with the drama, egos, and scandals worthy of a soap opera. The Pope wasn't just God's representative on earth. He was often the richest, most powerful man in Italy, and sometimes the most corrupt. Nowhere was this more apparent than during the reigns of the so-called papal playboys, men who blended sacred duty with personal pleasure as easily as wine with water. Take Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name became synonymous with sin draped in silk. He fathered at least 8 children officially. Unofficially, well, Rome lost count. His mistress, the beautiful Vannozza dei Catane, lived openly in a palazzo near the Vatican, while his other lover, Giulia Farnese, was openly referred to as the Pope's concubine by half of Europe. And while he preached virtue, his son, Cesare Borgia, carved a trail of blood across Italy, and his daughter, Lucrezia, was rumored to poison her lovers at banquets. The Borgias made no attempt to conceal their vices. They flaunted them in velvet robes embroidered with the family crest. But Alexander wasn't alone in his spiritual flexibility. Pope Julius II, nicknamed the Warrior Pope, spent more time wearing armor than vestments, leading armies instead of reciting prayers. He was known to swear like a soldier and commission art like a king. Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel were ironically funded by a pontiff who had fathered at least one illegitimate daughter. Meanwhile, Pope Leo X, from the Medici family, treated the papacy like a Florentine bank account, throwing parties so lavish that even Roman nobles blushed. For these men, indulgences weren't just a church doctrine, they were a lifestyle. Their banquets were attended by cardinals, courtesans, poets, and painters, all swimming in gold and gossip. The Vatican treasury was depleted not by crusades, but by carnival masks and mistresses. And yet, the faithful continued to donate, believing the Pope to be the moral anchor of the world. Rome's streets knew better. When a new pope was elected, the people didn't inquire about his holiness. They placed bets on his lovers. The church had become a theater of sin dressed in silk and incense. Behind every holy decree lay a heartbeat, lusty, ambitious, and entirely human. If the popes were the kings of sin, then the courtesans of Rome were its queens. And these weren't the back-alley variety, but the glittering elite, the so-called courtigiani onesti, or honest courtesans, honest, of course, in the same way that a wolf is honest about wanting sheep. These women could quote scripture in one breath and recite Ovid in the next, wearing gowns that could bankrupt a cardinal and jewelry that probably already had. One of the most infamous was Imperia Cognati, known simply as La Divina Imperia. Her name alone inspired both awe and fear in noblemen. She entertained cardinals, artists, and ambassadors in salons perfumed with incense and scandal. She wasn't just a beauty, she was an intellectual, a woman who could dismantle a bishop's argument about virtue while simultaneously sipping Venetian wine. When she died, the city mourned her as if she were royalty. Even members of the clergy sent flowers, pretending it was out of Christian charity rather than fond memory. Then there was Tullia d'Aragona, poet, philosopher, and rumored lover of half the Vatican secretaries. Tullia wrote essays defending women's right to pleasure, something that made priests choke on their communion wafers. Her home became a gathering place for artists and thinkers, where discussions about theology somehow always circled back to the topic of lust. These women navigated the treacherous waters of Roman society like seasoned diplomats. In a city ruled by men who preached purity but practiced indulgence, the courtesans became the most cunning players. They knew every secret, every affair, and every whispered promise made in candlelit confessionals. A well-placed word from a courtesan could ruin a career or ignite a papal feud. And they weren't just tolerated, they were, in many ways, necessary. When diplomacy failed, Rome didn't send soldiers, it sent smiles. Noble women lived under constant surveillance, but courtesans moved freely, their charms serving as unofficial ambassadors. Beneath their painted lips and jeweled corsets, they held the true intelligence network of the Renaissance. Ironically, these sinners often displayed more wit and dignity than their supposedly moral superiors. They played the system that oppressed them and turned it into an art form. While priests chased them in secret and poets immortalized them in verse, the courtesans of Rome proved that power didn't always wear a mitre. Sometimes it wore a veil of silk. While priests and popes made headlines with their excesses, the noble women of Renaissance Rome cultivated their own brand of scandal, one far more discreet but no less daring. These women lived in marble palaces gilded with virtue, yet their hearts and their letters burned with passion. Marriage in their world was a political contract, not a romantic union. So, when a duchess found herself chained to a dull husband twice her age, the natural solution was a confessor, one who listened very carefully and, on occasion, stayed the night. Among the whispered legends was Vittoria Colonna, a celebrated poet and the widow of a nobleman who had died on the battlefield. Her piety made her a darling of Rome's religious circles, yet her friendship with Michelangelo raised eyebrows that never fully lowered. Their correspondence, filled with spiritual longing and poetic tenderness, walked the razor's edge between divine love and forbidden desire. The Church labeled it Platonic, Rome called it obvious. Others were far less subtle, the Orsini and Farnese women. Names that carried as much weight as the popes themselves, used their beauty and influence to entangle cardinals, artists, and ambassadors alike. Their salons became theaters of flirtation, where poetry, music, and philosophy were simply pretexts for seduction. Affairs were conducted through coded letters, saintly portraits concealing miniature love notes, and the occasional pilgrimage that conveniently led to a lover's villa outside the city walls. But discretion was essential for survival. While a nobleman's indiscretion might be excused as a vigorous temperament, a woman's could be punished with exile, or worse. That didn't stop them. Many noble women mastered the art of appearing holy while living wickedly. They attended confession daily, ensuring their sins never piled up too high, and dressed modestly in public while concealing embroidered bodices beneath their cloaks. Behind every painted virgin on a palace wall, there was a story of guilt and longing. And while the Vatican thundered about purity, Rome's noble women wrote sonnets about passion. They understood the rules of the game: sin quietly, repent beautifully, and never get caught. In a city where men wielded power publicly, women learned to wield it in private, and often their whispers in the dark echoed louder than any sermon from the pulpit. Art was Rome's most respectable disguise for desire. Beneath the halo of divine inspiration, painters and sculptors filled chapels with visions that were less about heaven and more about flesh. The Renaissance brought about a revival of the human form, and artists embraced it with an enthusiasm that occasionally blurred the line between beauty and blasphemy. Take Raphael, Rome's golden boy. His frescoes radiated serenity, but behind that serenity lay a man famously incapable of resisting temptation. His muse, La Fornarina, a baker's daughter whose curves inspired half his Madonnas, became his obsession, his hidden partner, and, depending on who you asked, the true model for the Virgin Mary herself. When Raphael died young, rumors circulated that it wasn't from fever, but from exhaustion after a night of overzealous artistic study. Michelangelo, in contrast, wrestled with guilt as much as with marble. His figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling were technically biblical, but no one could ignore how lovingly he sculpted every muscle and curve. Some church officials grumbled that his saints looked a little too human. Michelangelo's defenders called it divine anatomy. His critics called it pornography. The man himself prayed, sculpted, and agonized, torn between devotion and the undeniable beauty of the human body. And then there were the real rebels, Caravaggio chief among them. His art shone with divine light, but dripped with human vice. His models were often prostitutes and thieves plucked straight from the streets, their raw sensuality painted onto the faces of saints and martyrs. To him, holiness and sin were inseparable twins. His Judith beheading Holofernes was painted with such violence and erotic tension that viewers couldn't decide whether to cross themselves or look away. For every sacred commission, there was an unholy inspiration. Artists were paid by the church to glorify God, but in doing so, they also glorified the human body, the very thing the church warned against. Their studios were confessionals, with paint and skin instead of rosaries. In Renaissance Rome, art wasn't just decoration, it was temptation made visible. Each brushstroke was a gamble between salvation and scandal. And as frescoes bloomed across the city's walls, so too did the rumor that God's greatest masterpiece wasn't the soul, but the naked human form. If you wanted a glimpse into the true soul of Renaissance Rome, not the marble statues or papal decrees, but the pulsing, laughing, sinful heart, you went during Carnival. For a few days each year, Rome forgot its morals and indulged in its appetites. Masks concealed faces, wine replaced sermons, and the line between priest and peasant vanished beneath the glitter of torchlight. During Carnival, even the church relaxed its grip. Cardinals attended masquerades to observe the youth, which usually meant chasing dancers until dawn. Monks wandered the streets drunk on spiced wine, quoting scripture with the confidence of men who hadn't read it recently. Even the Pope, safely behind the Vatican walls, was said to peer from his balconies, amused by his city's annual descent into chaos. The streets overflowed with symbolism and sin. Floats carried allegories of virtue triumphing over vice, though most spectators secretly rooted for vice. Courtesans disguised themselves as nuns. Nuns disguised themselves as courtesans. And both seemed to relish the confusion. Confessionals were packed the following week, with priests shaking their heads solemnly while taking careful notes on who had done what with whom, the details of which became Rome's unofficial gossip network. A penitent might confess her affair with a married cardinal, only to find her sins recited back to her later by a smirking servant. Secrets had a short lifespan in the eternal city. One monk even quipped that in Rome, the Holy Spirit didn't descend as a dove, It arrived as a rumor. The contradiction was spectacular. Sin was punished and celebrated simultaneously. Carnival parades passed beneath frescoes of the Last Judgment. The same hands that tossed roses into the crowd clasped rosaries the next morning. The faithful blamed it all on human weakness, as though weakness were the city's favorite sport. When the festivities ended, Rome washed its face and put its halo back on. The priests thundered about virtue, the nobles returned to their marriages, and the streets smelled of incense instead of sweat and wine once more. But the memory lingered. Behind every saintly procession was a hangover, and beneath every whispered Ave Maria, there lurked a knowing smile. Because everyone in Rome understood one thing: forgiveness came cheap, but the pleasures of sin were priceless. No discussion of Renaissance Rome's moral collapse would be complete without mentioning the Borgias, the family that transformed sin into statecraft. If ordinary Romans gossiped about lust and greed, the Borgias patented it. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, ruled not as a shepherd of souls, but as the godfather of an Italian crime syndicate. If that crime syndicate also issued indulgences, his Vatican was a stage for decadence. Witnesses recounted banquets where courtesans dined naked, and rooms were draped in silk and perfumed with scandal. One particularly infamous night, later dubbed a banquet of chestnuts, featured 50 dancers, cardinals tossing roasted chestnuts onto the floor, and guests crawling to collect them in a display of shameless indulgence. Whether the story was exaggerated is almost irrelevant. Rome believed it, and that was enough. Rodrigo's children were the ultimate proof of his complicated legacy. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's favorite son, was charming, handsome, and utterly ruthless. He murdered rivals with the same efficiency his father used to grant pardons. Cesare's sister, Lucrezia, became a legend in her own right, accused of incest, poisonings, and seductions, although much of it was likely propaganda spread by her enemies. Still, her ability to manipulate the men around her, husbands, lovers, even popes, made her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. The Borgias blurred every line between holiness and hedonism. Their private vices spilled into public policy. Cardinals were appointed through bribery. Sins were forgiven for gold, and marriage alliances were sealed with bedsheets instead of signatures. Rome had witnessed corrupt popes before, but never one who treated the papacy quite so explicitly as a family business. Yet, in their defense, the Borgias were simply more transparent about what everyone else was doing in secret. While other families cloaked their excesses behind Latin sermons, the Borgias flaunted theirs proudly, gilded and perfumed. They transformed the Vatican into both a brothel and a battlefield, depending on the day. When Alexander VI finally died, ironically after a banquet, Rome sighed in relief, but also in a strange sort of admiration. He had been a sinner, yes, but an unforgettable one. His reign left the church stained, his name cursed, but his legend immortal. In Renaissance Rome, the Borgias demonstrated a timeless truth. In the right hands, sin could be the ultimate power. For all its pronouncements of outrage and sermons, the church in Renaissance Rome was not merely a victim of sin, it was its enabler. The hierarchy thundered against lust from the pulpit, but behind those marble walls, the clinking of coin purses often drowned out the voice of conscience. Every indulgence sold, every absolution granted, was part of a vast, intricate system of forgiveness. A man could bed his mistress, confess his transgression the following morning, and emerge spiritually cleansed, provided his donation was suitably generous. This wasn't mere hypocrisy, it was a business transaction. Sin, after all, was a consistently reliable source of revenue. The Vatican's coffers swelled with riches from those seeking redemption for pleasures they fully intended to indulge in again and again. In a way, the Church had transformed desire into a subscription service. Sin, confess, pay, repeat, ad infinitum. Even the printing of indulgence certificates became a booming industry. Monks, who should have been painstakingly illuminating Bibles, were instead occupied with the mundane task of tallying receipts. Cardinals owned sprawling vineyards, engaged in lending practices, and maintained opulent estates, complete with retinues of servants and a stable of lovers. One bishop was so notorious for his numerous illegitimate offspring that the locals wryly nicknamed his palace the House of the Lord and his extended family. And yet, these very men presided over inquisitions and moral trials, condemning humble peasants for sins that were practically enshrined as Vatican traditions. As voices advocating for reform began to emerge, monks whispering that the Church had strayed from its spiritual core, they were swiftly silenced or banished. Accusing God's representatives of acting like common merchants was a dangerous game. Still, whispers of papal indulgences and debauchery spread with remarkable speed, outpacing any official decree. Even the most devout began to raise a skeptical eyebrow when priests preached against temptation, having witnessed too many sermons conclude at the nearest tavern. The irony was almost divinely ordained. The more fervently the Church condemned sin, the more it became inextricably dependent upon it. Without lust, greed, and the resulting guilt, half of Rome's economy, and indeed half of the Vatican's, would crumble overnight. Some attempted to reform the system from within. A few honest friars dared to denounce the corruption, only to be met with indifference, reassignment to remote outposts, or a sudden, mysterious illness. Others simply resigned themselves to the fact that Rome's holiness was, at best, a theoretical construct. As one weary priest lamented in his private diary, "We do not dwell in the city of God, but in the city God chooses to overlook." And so, beneath the soft glow of 1,000 candles and the watchful eyes of painted saints, the Church continued its elaborate performance, a spectacle that was half prayer, half indulgence, and wholly human in its imperfections. By the close of the Renaissance, Rome had perfected the art of appearing holy. Every street corner boasted a shrine. Every family had their designated confessor, and every sinner possessed a carefully rehearsed excuse. Virtue was no longer an inherent quality of the soul. It had become a carefully tailored costume. The city wore it with pride, stitched together with fine silks, shimmering pearls, and just enough incense to mask the pervasive stench of hypocrisy. Men strode confidently into church, prayer books in one hand and clandestine love letters clutched in the other. Women piously crossed themselves during Mass, while discreetly locking eyes with their lovers 2 pews away. Artists immortalized their muses by painting their faces onto the very angels adorning church walls. Popes commissioned grand altarpieces as atonement for the lavish feasts they had hosted the night before. Everyone in Rome was, in essence, an actor on a divine stage, and the theater was the world itself. The clever ones understood the unspoken rules of the game. One didn't need to be virtuous, one simply had to appear so. A well-placed tear during confession, a generous donation to the poor, a suitably pious expression when sin was mentioned. Reputation was the currency of the city, and everyone guarded theirs with more vigilance than their very soul. To sin discreetly was merely to be human. To be caught was to be damned. Even morality itself became a fashionable commodity. Religious relics were traded like precious jewels, pilgrimages transformed into extravagant social events, and charity became the Renaissance equivalent of public relations. When noblemen funded the construction of new churches, it wasn't for the salvation of their souls, but for the elevation of their social standing. A vibrant fresco depicting the Last Judgment could cleanse a tarnished legacy far more effectively than 1,000 mumbled prayers. The Vatican called it faith. Rome called it strategy. And yet, amidst all this pervasive duplicity, there was something undeniably, almost poetically, beautiful. The city was corrupt, yes, but it was also vibrantly alive. Passion and hypocrisy danced together in a perfect, if somewhat unsettling, rhythm, giving birth to art, architecture, and revolutionary ideas that continue to captivate the world today. For every sin whispered in the shadows, a masterpiece was born in the light. In the end, Renaissance Rome was not simply wicked, it was profoundly human. It revealed to the world that even the holiest of men could succumb to earthly desires, that the most pious of women could indulge in secret dreams, and that breathtaking beauty could flourish even in the fertile soil of corruption. The Eternal City endured its numerous scandals because, deep down, it never truly aspired to perfection. It sought something far more enduring, immortality, and in that relentless pursuit, even sin itself became, in a twisted way, sacred. You weren't born into fame or privilege. You were born into the dust and the pungent aroma of horse sweat. The stables were your cradle, the rhythmic pounding of hooves your lullaby. In the Roman world, charioteers weren't typically born of noble lineage. They emerged from the ranks of the chained and the dispossessed. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or impoverished freedmen, marked by more scars than they possessed coins. But none of that mattered, because within the hallowed grounds of the Circus Maximus, even a slave could ascend to the status of a god, provided he survived long enough to cross the finish line in triumph. From the moment you learned to walk, you also learned to run alongside the horses. They were your only teachers, impatient, immensely powerful, and utterly merciless. The trainers barked orders, cracked whips, and delivered the harsh truth that every aspiring young charioteer dreaded to hear. The sand will drink your blood long before the crowd even bothers to remember your name. But you refused to listen. You possessed a hunger that was sharper and more insistent than any fear. Each morning began before the break of dawn. You would shovel mountains of dung, meticulously brush their manes, and haul buckets of water until your arms trembled with exhaustion. And when the trainers weren't watching, you'd sneak onto the empty track, sensing the profound silence of the circus as if it were an entity observing your every move. You'd imagine the stands teeming with hundreds of thousands of Romans, cheering, jeering, wagering their entire fortunes on your potential death or glorious victory. It wasn't faith that fueled your ambition. It was an unyielding pride. Pride and the intoxicating dream that, for a few fleeting minutes, all of Rome would witness your greatness. The Circus Maximus was the very beating heart of the empire, more powerful than any temple, more clamorous than any Senate debate. 200,000 spectators, their collective voices thundering through the marble seating, creating a cacophony that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Men screamed, women fainted, and fortunes were won or lost in the blink of an eye. In the time it took to complete 7 grueling laps, no other stage on earth offered such unbridled madness or such unparalleled glory. At night, you'd lie awake in the stables, your gaze fixed on the oil lamps flickering against the rough-hewn walls. Somewhere in the distant hills, the noblemen slept soundly in their luxurious villas. But here, amidst the pungent smell of straw and sweat, heroes were forged in the crucible of hardship. You couldn't be sure whether you'd perish beneath the crushing weight of the hooves or rise above them to claim victory. You only knew one thing with unwavering certainty. One day, the crowd would chant your name. not as a slave, not as a mere servant, but as the undisputed master of the circus, the charioteer who had tamed the storm itself. The stables were your entire world, hot, noisy, and always just one mistake away from a gruesome death. You served the factions, the fiercely competitive racing teams of Rome, each as disciplined and ruthless as a legion of soldiers. There were the blues and the greens, the reds and the whites, four vibrant colors that divided the empire with a passion that transcended politics and even war. Every Roman citizen had a side, from the lowliest slaves in the taverns to the most powerful senators in their togas. The circus wasn't simply a form of entertainment, it was a religion, a quasi-sacred ritual, and you were about to become its high priest. You began as a lowly stable boy, a mere shadow amidst giants. You brushed the horses until your hands were raw and blistered, fed them a carefully measured mixture of barley and wine, and learned to interpret their every mood and subtle nuance as skillfully as a seasoned soldier reads the movements of the enemy. These weren't just ordinary beasts of burden. They were elite athletes, fierce warriors in harness, magnificent Spanish stallions, powerful Nubian mares, swift Cappadocian chargers. Creatures so valuable and highly prized that emperors themselves would wage wars over them. They were sacred and savage in equal measure. But danger bred discipline. The rival factions constantly sabotaged one another. Buckles were deliberately loosened, harnesses were surreptitiously cut, and feed was laced with deadly poisons. A single accident, a moment of carelessness, could spell the end of a promising career or even a life. You learned to sleep lightly, with one hand always near your trusty knife, and the other protectively resting on the reins. To safeguard the horses was to safeguard your own future. The Dominus Faconis, your team master, ruled the stables with an iron fist and a stinging whip. He instilled in you the brutal lesson that trust was a weakness and hesitation was a prelude to death. He'd slap you hard on the shoulder and gruffly say, "If the horses don't fear you, boy, the crowd will never respect you." And yet, you understood that you couldn't rule by fear alone. You had to earn the horses' unwavering loyalty, to feel their heartbeats synchronize with yours as the chariot roared forward. That symbiotic bond was your only true armor. At night, the stables came alive with hushed murmurs of prayers and whispered incantations. Drivers would trace protective charms on the horses' foreheads, invoking Neptune, the powerful god of horses and the sea. Others offered libations of wine to Fortuna, the fickle goddess of luck, because skill alone was never enough. One snapped axle, one loosened strap, one heartbeat too late, and your body would be trampled into the unforgiving sand before the crowd even had a chance to gasp. Still, you persevered. You endured the sweltering heat, the back-breaking sweat, and the constant, ever-present risk of death, because every lap you completed around the circus promised something far more intoxicating than mere freedom, immortality. And you were willing to burn in those squalid stables until the gods themselves noticed your unwavering fire. Your first day behind the reins wasn't a race. It was a brutal battle against sheer, unadulterated terror. The chariot was far lighter and more fragile than it appeared, a delicate frame of wood and supple leather balanced precariously on knife-thin wheels. One wrong move, one slight stumble from the horses, and you'd be dragged to a gruesome death before anyone could even manage to shout your name. The trainers euphemistically called it learning. You called it surviving. Every sunrise brought more grueling drills. You learned to stand ramrod straight and perfectly balanced while the chariot rattled violently over the uneven ground. The reins were wrapped, not in your hands, but tightly around your waist, a technique that allowed you to steer with your entire body. But if you fell, you'd be dragged mercilessly until you were nothing more than a pulpy mess. It was the first, and perhaps the cruelest, lesson. Mastery and death were inextricably linked, bound together by the same knots. The horses were both your indispensable partners and your potential executioners. You meticulously memorized every snort, every twitch, every subtle tremor. 4 horses, 1 mind. That was the ultimate goal. If one faltered, the others would inevitably follow. If one bolted in terror, all were doomed. You learned to whisper soothing words to them, to curse them with venomous fury, to pray with them in desperate supplication. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of fire and fear, reflected your own innermost emotions. You didn't control them. You became one with them. The trainers barked insults, flung whips with reckless abandon, and hurled abuse when you inevitably failed. One grizzled old veteran, half-deaf and seemingly half-mad, told you in a raspy voice that a true orga, a true charioteer, never blinks during a crash. You'll see splinters fly, blood spray, skulls crack, he croaked. But if you blink, boy, you'll miss your one fleeting moment to live. He wasn't wrong. To simulate the chaotic conditions of the circus, they'd unleash you into mock races, a maelstrom of dust, shouted commands, and pure, unadulterated chaos. Your rivals slammed their chariots mercilessly into your wheels, attempting to shatter them into pieces. You learned to swing your whip not just at the horses, but at the other drivers, aiming for their arms or their faces with cold precision. There were no rules in training because there were none in the arena. Survival was the only lesson that truly mattered. By dusk, your muscles screamed in agony. Your hands bled profusely, and your heart beat with the frenzied rhythm of a drum of war. But as the pain dulled, something colder and far more insidious began to take its place. A strange, unsettling calm. You realized that fear was utterly useless. The unforgiving sand didn't care who lived or who died. It only remembered those who left their indelible mark upon it. That night, you fell asleep amongst the restless horses, your fingers still instinctively gripping an imaginary rein. You dreamed of thunderous hooves, shattered wheels, and a vast crowd chanting a name that you swore would soon be yours. The first time you entered the Circus Maximus, you forgot to breathe. Your entire body trembled uncontrollably. The sheer noise alone was enough to kill a man. 200,000 Romans roared like a tempestuous ocean, their cheers crashing against the stone seats in deafening waves. Trumpets blared, banners rippled in the wind, and the overwhelming smell of sweat, dust, and roasted meat filled the air, creating an intoxicating and almost overwhelming sensory overload. This wasn't just a race, it was religion in perpetual motion. The gods of Rome were watching from their celestial perches, and so was every gambler, thief, senator, and slave in the vast empire. You took your designated place in the starting gates, the carceres, where 8 chariots were lined up like arrows poised to be launched. The horses were wild with pent-up energy, their nostrils flaring, their hooves clawing frantically at the sand. You whispered their names like a sacred prayer: Aquila, Nero, Pallas, and Flame, and tightened your grip on the reins, wrapped securely around your waist. Across the track, the opposing factions glared with undisguised animosity. The Greens were heavily favored to win today, and the Blues, your team, were desperate for a victory. The influential bettors had already decided who should live and who should die. You just had to prove them wrong. The official dropped his white cloth, the signal to begin. A heartbeat of utter silence, and then all hell broke loose. The gates exploded open, and 8 chariots surged forward like unleashed gods. Sand flew in all directions. Wheels screamed in protest, and you leaned into the first treacherous turn, your entire life hanging precariously in the balance on 2 spinning wooden circles. The first corner was a brutal battlefield. Drivers whipped their rivals with savage intensity, horses screamed in pain and terror, and the crowd howled for blood. You felt the jarring impact as a rival's chariot slammed violently into your wheel, attempting to shatter it into splinters. You countered with skill and precision, guiding your team tighter around the spina. The central barrier adorned with statues of Neptune and frolicking dolphins. You brushed past them so closely that droplets of salt water from the fountain splashed against your outstretched arm. 1 lap down, 6 more to go. The crowd's roar transformed into a rhythmic pulse, each cheer a drumbeat resonating deep within your chest. You could feel their eyes upon you, the scrutinizing gaze of thousands of strangers whose love or hate depended entirely on a single turn, a single moment of brilliance or catastrophic failure. For a fleeting moment, you understood why men willingly risked everything for this exhilarating madness. Death no longer frightened you, it thrilled you. When you crossed the finish line, you couldn't immediately tell if you had won or simply survived. The sand clung to your face like ashes, and your hands shook uncontrollably from the sheer physical strain. But above the cacophony of the crowd, one thing was undeniably clear. They were chanting, maybe not loudly, not yet, but you distinctly heard it. Your name, and you knew that it was only the beginning. Victory in the circus was an intoxicating experience, louder than a thunderclap, sweeter than the finest wine. When you emerged victorious, the crowd's roar swallowed you whole, lifting you up on a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated adulation. Women tossed garlands of flowers, gamblers wept tears of unadulterated joy, and the emperor himself might even offer a subtle nod of approval. You'd return to the stables like a conquering general returning from a triumphant campaign, your magnificent horses steaming with sweat and pride. For a slave or a freedman, no triumph in Rome could compare. In a single afternoon, you could earn what a legionary soldier made in 10 long years, and with that victory came everything else a man could possibly desire. Fame, gold, desire, and powerful patrons who lined up to sponsor you. Politicians sought your friendship, and poets immortalized your name on wax tablets. The entire city whispered about your extraordinary skill, your almost supernatural luck, and your supposed charm. Even noble women, bored with their aloof marble husbands and endlessly arranged dinners, sent you secret messages hinting at clandestine rendezvous. To Rome, you were no longer just a man. You were a myth come to life, a legend with a palpable pulse. But the higher you climbed, the sharper and more treacherous the knives became. Jealousy was the second language of the circus. Your rivals plotted accidents with cold, calculated precision. Fanatical fans rioted if their chosen color suffered a defeat, and the very same crowd that cheered your name today would be just as quick to curse it tomorrow. You learned to smile carefully, to speak with measured words, and to sleep lightly, always wary of potential danger. Glory had its own intoxicating smell, and so did betrayal. Your hard-won winnings bought you freedom from your master, but not from the constant threat of danger. Free men could race under their own name, and many did, until they died, tangled in the reins or crushed beneath the relentless hooves of their own horses. Statues were erected in honor of the lucky ones, but most ended up broken and forgotten, their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside the city walls. Every lap you raced was a desperate wager against the gods, and they rarely paid out twice. And yet, No amount of gold or perceived safety could ever match the electrifying feeling of standing before that roaring crowd, your hand raised in victory, the laurel crown pressed firmly against your sweat-soaked hair. You'd gaze up at the marble stands, take in the sight of the nobles who had once completely ignored you, and feel their envy radiating towards you like the scorching heat of the midday sun. For a few stolen moments, you weren't a slave or a mere mortal. You were the very pulse of Rome itself. Then you'd leave the track, still trembling from the adrenaline-fueled speed, knowing with chilling certainty that tomorrow could bring it all crashing down. But as you meticulously brushed your horses and cleaned the dust from their magnificent manes, you whispered the same solemn vow that every charioteer made. Let me die fast, but let me die famous. Rome's heart didn't beat for emperors or mighty legions. It beat for colors. Blue versus green, red versus white. These weren't just racing teams. They were tribes, cults, fervent armies of passion that divided neighborhoods and completely toppled any semblance of reason. The city's unwavering loyalty was painted in vibrant pigments. A man might eventually forgive an insult directed at his own mother, but never one aimed at his chosen faction. As a skilled driver for the Blues, you wore their color like a suit of protective armor. To the faithful, you were a revered hero, a champion worthy of endless praise. To the Greens, you were a hated enemy, an obstacle that had to be eliminated at all costs. Rabid fans scrawled your name on tavern walls, sang songs celebrating your victories, and started violent brawls over even the slightest perceived slight to your honor. When you passed through the bustling markets, mothers pointed you out to their impressionable sons, using you as an example of what they could one day aspire to be. But you also learned to travel with your cloak pulled low, concealing your face. Because in the wrong part of town, admiration could quickly turn into a deadly assassination attempt. The factions were more than just a sporting spectacle. They were a potent force in Roman politics. Wealthy senators funded the teams, emperors openly played favorites, and riots frequently flared up when races turned particularly bloody. The Circus Maximus had its own unique brand of war and diplomacy. A deliberately sabotaged wheel could easily spark fierce street battles. A disputed victory could set an entire district ablaze. When the Greens publicly accused your faction of bribing a high-ranking official, the entire city erupted in chaos. By nightfall, torches illuminated the Forum, and the Tiber River ran red with the blood spilled in faction-fueled violence. Even the emperors themselves feared the factions. They weren't just mere fans. They were Rome's unofficial Second Army. Charioteers like you held the immense power to either calm or ignite them at will. Once, after a particularly impressive string of victories, the emperor himself invited you to dine in his opulent palace. Not necessarily out of admiration, but out of a sense of cautious self-preservation. He wanted to be absolutely sure that your growing fame served the interests of the throne, rather than posing a direct threat to it. You smiled politely, bowed respectfully, and toasted to the continued glory of Rome, pretending not to notice his heavily armed guards, subtly tightening their grips on their swords. But amidst all the swirling rivalries and political machinations, there was one face that haunted your waking thoughts. Your equally skilled counterpart in the Green faction, a formidable charioteer named Felix. He was fast, brutal, and utterly fearless, a truly dangerous opponent. The crowd affectionately called him the Serpent. Every race between the two of you wasn't just a contest of skill and speed. It was a declaration of war. You'd lock eyes with him at the starting line, each of you knowing with chilling certainty that only one of you would leave the circus alive that day. The vibrant colors, the thunderous cheers, the allure of glory, It was all just smoke and mirrors, a carefully constructed illusion that concealed the blood and carnage beneath. Rome didn't truly love its heroes. It devoured them, consuming them with insatiable fervor. And as long as the insatiable crowd demanded danger and spectacle, the circus would continue to feed them one gruesome crash, one lifeless corpse, and one triumphant color at a time. The circus might have appeared beautiful and glamorous from the stands, but from the precarious seat of a speeding chariot, it was nothing more than a glorified slaughterhouse. Death came swiftly, loudly, and with merciless indifference. One snapped wheel, one frightened horse, and it was all over. The Romans even had a specific word for it, naufragium, meaning shipwreck, because that's precisely what a crash looked like. Wood splintering like the hull of a ship against jagged rocks, bodies flung violently into the air, and the screams of the dying swallowed whole by the deafening roar of the bloodthirsty crowd. You witnessed your first such naufragium when you were just 16 years old. The driver ahead of you misjudged the treacherous turn around the spina. His wheel clipped the barrier, shattered instantly, and sent his chariot spinning wildly out of control. The horses panicked, dragging him by the tangled reins as his limp body bounced across the unforgiving sand like a broken doll. You smelled the metallic tang of blood long before you actually saw it. The crowd erupted, not in horror or sympathy, but in a collective cry of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. Death, it seemed, was their favorite kind of finish line. Every race was a high-stakes gamble with fate. You learned to watch for the telltale warning signs. The almost imperceptible flicker in a horse's gait, the slight wobble of a rival's wheel, the barely noticeable tension in the reins. You trained yourself to react faster than conscious thought, to steer instinctively when reason would inevitably freeze in fear. The circus ruthlessly punished hesitation. A good charioteer died quickly. A truly great one learned to make death his unlikely ally. The crashes were inevitably worse near the meta, the turning posts that marked the end of each lap. Drivers fought tooth and nail for the coveted inside lane where victory resided, but so did potential disaster. You hugged the curve so tightly that you could feel the rough marble scrape against your chariot's axle. Too wide, and you'd lose the race. Too tight, and you'd join the wreckage. There was no middle ground, only the tantalizing prospect of glory or the crushing certainty of ruin. Sometimes, when a catastrophic crash happened behind you, the screams of the dying faded beneath the thunderous pounding of hooves. You learned never to look back. To survive in the circus, you had to be utterly ruthless. Compassion was a luxury reserved for poets and priests, not for men who dared to race against the gods. You told yourself that each crash was simply another sacrifice to Neptune, the powerful god of horses and the sea, and you whispered a silent prayer that it would never be your turn to offer that ultimate sacrifice. But every seasoned driver knew the chilling truth. Luck was a fragile rope that always frayed with time. One day, you'd inevitably feel it snap, and when that fateful moment arrived, the circus would continue to roar, the crowd would continue to cheer, and Rome would simply move on, its insatiable appetite for blood and spectacle as endless as its unquenchable thirst for speed. If death was always just one treacherous turn away, then unimaginable fortune resided just around the other. For the select few who managed to survive long enough, chariot racing offered the quickest and most direct route from the chains of slavery to the dizzying heights of staggering wealth. Rome adored its winners with the same unbridled frenzy it used to crucify its losers. You began as mere property, but with each hard-fought victory, you became something far rarer and more valuable. A man who had somehow managed to seize control of his own destiny. Your winnings grew faster than the crowds could chant your name. Bags overflowing with silver coins, glistening laurel crowns, exquisitely crafted cloaks, and gleaming golden goblets. Spoils once reserved exclusively for victorious generals were now yours to command. You bought your freedom first, then a lavish house, and finally, magnificent horses of your very own. Men who had once spat contemptuously at your feet now bowed deeply when you entered the local tavern. Powerful senators nodded to you respectfully in the forum, pretending that they didn't remember the indelible mark of your slave brand. You simply smiled because you knew that they did. Women followed too, some driven by genuine affection, but most lured by the intoxicating allure of your legend. Courtesans, wealthy widows, even high priestesses found convenient reasons to seek your company and offer their prayers. Fame had the uncanny ability to transform everything you touched into something extravagant and excessive. Lavish banquets lasted until the break of dawn, your name echoing through the halls in drunken toasts. You spent money as carelessly as sand slipping through your fingers because you understood that the gods had made you fast, but not immortal. And yet, the higher you climbed, the lonelier the air became. Trusted friends transformed into fawning flatterers. Admiring fans morphed into opportunistic thieves. You slowly began to understand that Rome didn't truly love you. It loved the myth that you had become, the man who cheated death, who tamed thunder, who could make the city momentarily forget its all-consuming hunger for just one glorious afternoon. Still, you couldn't bring yourself to stop. Fortune was a fever that you couldn't shake, an addiction that consumed your very being. The circus was your sacred temple, and each race was just another desperate prayer to keep your fragile luck alive. You invested heavily in your own team, hiring skilled grooms and even training promising younger drivers. Some respectfully called you Dominus Orige, Lord of the Charioteers. It sounded undeniably noble, but you knew better. Beneath all the gold and the thunderous applause, the same chilling truth burned brightly. Your entire empire rested precariously on spinning wheels and the frightened hooves of horses. At lavish feasts, poets recited your name alongside those of legendary heroes like Hercules and Achilles. You laughed, but deep down, the comparison sent a shiver down your spine. Heroes never lived long in Rome. They burned brightly, then vanished without a trace. And you knew that one day, whether due to old age, a tragic accident, or the envious machinations of your rivals, the circus would inevitably take back everything it had so generously given. Fortune was a generous mistress, but she always collected her debts in the end. Time caught up with every charioteer, no matter how fast his horses could run. Your hands, once strong enough to tame a team of wild stallions, began to tremble when you held the reins. The cheers that had once lifted your soul to soaring heights now sounded distant and muffled, as if heard through the echoing chambers of memory. You told yourself that you'd retire after just one more race, after one final taste of the roar of the crowd. But the circus had a way of whispering in your ear, seductively promising just one more. The younger drivers were undeniably faster now, and reckless young boys who raced with the same youthful abandon that you once had, with no thought whatsoever of survival. They respectfully called you Veteranus, half in genuine respect, half in thinly veiled pity. You watched them train and saw your own ghost reflected in their wide, hungry eyes, fearless, doomed, and utterly captivating. The track hadn't changed, but you undeniably had. The same sand that had once promised you immortality now patiently waited to swallow you whole. Still, the familiar itch returned every morning. You simply couldn't ignore the seductive sound of wheels rattling, the thunderous pounding of hooves, the intoxicating pull of imminent danger. So you strapped the worn reins around your waist one last time and stepped out into the warm sunlight. The crowd erupted, not just out of routine, but out of genuine recognition. You were a living legend now, a revered relic of the golden years. The gates opened with a resounding clang. The horses lunged forward with ferocious intensity. And for a glorious heartbeat, you felt 20 years old again. The wind tore wildly at your tunic. Sand stung your face, and your pulse perfectly matched the thunderous pounding of the hooves. You hugged the meta far tighter than you should have, your pride overriding your sense. Behind you, a rival's wheel clipped your chariot's axle. You felt the jolt, the violent shudder, the whisper of destiny. Then, a heartbeat of absolute silence. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, the sunlight gleaming on the flawless marble of the statues. The collective intake of breath from the hushed crowd, the very moment before the inevitable crash. There was no time for prayer, only a serene smile. You had always carried the knowledge that the circus, in its chaotic glory, would ultimately claim you. When the disaster struck, the crowd erupted, not in sorrow, but in a gasp of collective awe. It was said that the horses, untethered, completed 3 more laps before finally halting. The sand beneath their hooves stained a deep crimson. Your broken body was carried from the track, draped in the proud blue colors of your faction, and laid to rest beneath a modest monument just beyond the city walls. The inscription read simply, "He rode with the gods. He fell like a storm unleashed." And somewhere, beyond the echoes of the circus, he still races, forever chasing the thunder. Long before the majestic pyramids pierced the skyline, or the grand temples reverberated with hymns to Ra, the lifeblood of Egypt was already at work. The Nile, it was far more than a mere river. It was a world-shaping engineer, carving existence from barren desolation. Each year, with unwavering regularity, it surged from the heart of Africa, swollen with the torrential rains of distant lands, bestowing its precious gift upon the arid valleys of Egypt. The floodwaters brought with them silt, rich, dark, and utterly miraculous. Without this fertile deposit, Egypt would have remained a desolate kingdom of dust and relentless wind. To the ancient Egyptians, the annual inundation was not simply a natural phenomenon, but a divine rhythm, a sacred pulse. They didn't just passively observe the river, they listened to its voice. The rising waters signified rebirth and renewal, while their retreat heralded the beginning of the bountiful harvest season. Every life, from the lowliest peasant to the all-powerful pharaoh, depended entirely on this vital cycle. The entire Egyptian calendar revolved around it, divided into 3 sacred seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. The Nile was the embodiment of time itself, a living clock that dictated the rhythm of eternity. Yet, the river was notoriously unpredictable. In some years, it swelled too high, drowning fields and entire villages in its relentless surge. In others, it failed to flood at all, leaving a devastating famine in its wake. Therefore, the Egyptians, as humans always do when confronted with the unpredictable forces of nature, learned to manage and shape it. They meticulously measured its depths using nilometers carved into the sacred temple stones, recorded its ever-changing moods, and developed a sophisticated science around its behavior. Over countless generations, they transformed a wild, untamed river into a precision instrument. When the floodwaters began to recede, the people acted swiftly, digging canals and constructing reservoirs to capture and retain the precious remaining water. Each family played its crucial role in this annual ritual, transforming mud and water into structured order. What began as a struggle for survival evolved into a testament to human mastery. Egypt didn't simply exist alongside the Nile. It engineered it, shaping its course and controlling its flow. In the shimmering surface of its waters, civilization found its own reflection. The river served as a vital connection between gods and mortals, priests and peasants, life and death. Its banks became the stage where humanity learned that true control over nature lies not in brute domination, but in achieving harmonious balance. The Nile did not belong to Egypt. Rather, Egypt belonged to the Nile, and the river would continue to shape its destiny for millennia to come. When the Nile rose, all of Egypt held its collective breath. The flood was both a miracle and a menace, a blessing that could easily transform into utter ruin. For centuries, survival hinged on accurately predicting the river's unpredictable moods. And so, the Egyptians became skilled mathematicians, astute astronomers, and ingenious engineers long before those titles even existed. They measured the world not by the stars or the rise and fall of empires, but by the ever-present, life-giving water. The priests of Heliopolis diligently watched the sky, marking the annual rising of the star Sirius, known as Sopdet, which heralded the imminent arrival of the life-sustaining flood. Its appearance in the dawn sky was far from mere superstition. It was a celestial signal that the Nile was on its way, a sign of hope and renewal. Villagers would erupt in joyous cheers upon seeing it, for it meant that life would be renewed once more. However, predicting the flood was only half the battle. Controlling it was the true test of their ingenuity. Along the riverbanks, workers toiled tirelessly, digging canals that stretched for miles, guiding the waters into carefully constructed basins and channels. With simple wooden shovels and primitive stone picks, they carved Egypt's first arteries of irrigation. The engineers meticulously divided the land into fields, bordered by low earthen walls that trapped the floodwater, allowing it to slowly soak into the parched soil. When the waters eventually withdrew, they left behind the perfect level of moisture for planting barley, flax, and wheat. This was not chaos, but carefully orchestrated geometry. The fields were measured with meticulous precision, each plot mapped and taxed according to its inherent fertility. Surveyors, known as rope stretchers, walked the land after every flood, redrawing boundaries that had been washed away by the powerful currents. Their ropes were not just simple tools. They represented the very birth of mathematics itself. Yet, nature never fully yielded to control. When the river failed to rise sufficiently, devastating drought devoured everything in its path. Conversely, when it flooded excessively, entire villages vanished beneath the relentless surge. To further tame the unpredictable river, the Egyptians constructed dikes and embankments, and sometimes even small dams made of stone and mud. These ambitious projects required not only immense physical strength, but also unprecedented unity, a society capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of men with a single command. The Nile was far more than a mere source of sustenance. It was a proving ground for organization, labor management, and sheer genius. It demanded constant vigilance and richly rewarded unwavering discipline. Over generations, Egypt mastered the art of cooperation through the shared necessity of managing water resources. And as the river gradually obeyed, it taught its people a timeless lesson: that true civilization is not built through conquest and domination, but through harmonious rhythm, by mastering the flood without ever defying its fundamental nature. To the ancient Egyptians, time itself flowed directly from the Nile. The river's pulse shaped the calendar, the sacred rituals, and even the innermost emotions of an entire civilization. While other cultures marked the passing years by the reigns of kings or the unpredictable whims of war, Egypt measured its existence by the constant rise and fall of the life-giving water. Every year was a cyclical journey of death, rebirth, and bountiful harvest, played out not within the confines of temples or palaces, but in the ever-flowing current of the Nile. The Egyptians meticulously divided their year into 3 distinct seasons: Akhet, the inundation, when the floods completely submerged the fields; Peret, the growing season, when verdant crops sprouted from the rich black silt; and Shemu, the harvest, when the earth graciously yielded what the Nile had faithfully promised. Each season spanned 4 months, and each month consisted of 30 days, with a handful of additional festival days added to appease the gods and meticulously balance the cosmic order. The rhythm was profoundly mathematical, but its underlying meaning was deeply spiritual. When the star, Sopdet, or Sirius, graced the eastern sky just before dawn, it signaled the start of Akhet. Priests at temples situated along the river meticulously watched for its appearance with sacred precision. They believed that this shining herald was the goddess of the flood herself, her radiant light awakening the slumbering Nile. It was the Egyptians' first astronomical prediction, a cosmic calendar that seamlessly united the heavens, the earth, and the vital water. Every village had its own unique rituals to warmly welcome the flood. Farmers chanted songs to Hapi, the benevolent god of the Nile, offering loaves of bread and jugs of beer to ensure that the waters rose just enough, not so little as to bring starvation, but not so high as to drown their homes. The flood's arrival was not merely anticipated, it was celebrated with fervent joy, like the return of a beloved deity. The flood calendar bestowed upon the Egyptians something that no other early civilization possessed: predictability. They knew precisely when to plant, when to harvest, and when to store their precious grain. The Nile transformed chaos into order, nature into a reliable schedule, and mere survival into deeply ingrained tradition. Time, once perceived as wild and unknowable, now ticked with the unwavering certainty of a clock crafted from water. In the world beyond Egypt's borders, the changing seasons often brought fear and uncertainty. But here, the people of the Nile faced the future with remarkable calm and confidence. They did not attempt to resist the river's rhythmic flow. Instead, they wholeheartedly embraced it, living in perfect harmony with its natural cycles. In its steady heartbeat, they discovered a sense of eternity, measured not in fleeting years or unpredictable rains, but in the reliable repetition of the life-giving floods. The Egyptians didn't merely wait passively for the Nile to work its magic. They actively shaped and managed it with remarkable ingenuity. Every canal, basin, and reservoir was a carefully woven thread in the grand tapestry of their engineered landscape. The early pharaohs astutely understood that whoever controlled the vital water supply controlled the entire kingdom. Power flowed through strategically dug ditches and carefully constructed dikes, as surely as it did through ornate thrones and glittering crowns. The first canal builders were visionary pioneers, armed with nothing more than simple shovels. Using only rudimentary tools, wooden plows, woven baskets, and copper axes, they skillfully redirected the river's flow, carving channels through the unforgiving desert like veins coursing through a living body. These canals transformed the unpredictable flood into a reliably predictable harvest, expertly guiding water to fields located miles away from the main riverbanks. With each ambitious project, Egypt became less and less at the mercy of the Nile's fickle moods, and increasingly the master of its inherent rhythm. By the time of the Old Kingdom, irrigation had evolved into a major state enterprise. Thousands of laborers toiled under the watchful eyes of skilled engineers and meticulous scribes, each carefully measured basin recorded with unwavering precision. Canals were not merely practical, they were profoundly political. When a pharaoh commissioned a new network of waterways, it was not solely to feed his people, it was also to demonstrate his divine authority, to prove that he was indeed chosen by the gods. The God-King did not simply pray for the life-giving floods. He commanded them, showcasing his power and influence. One of the earliest and most impressive great works was said to be the Bar Yusuf, the Canal of Joseph. Whether rooted in myth or historical memory, it carried precious water from the Nile to the Fayum Depression, transforming a barren basin into Egypt's oldest reclaimed farmland. Centuries later, it continued to nourish countless villages, serving as a living monument to ancient hydraulic engineering. Even remote desert towns were inextricably bound to the river's life-giving flow. Irrigation transformed their economies and shaped their loyalties. A canal that ran dry could spell ruin for an entire province, while a well-timed diversion could spark the growth of a thriving new settlement. Water became a form of currency, and the pharaoh was its ultimate banker, controlling its distribution and ensuring its equitable use. Scribes meticulously documented every precious drop, carving detailed tallies onto papyrus scrolls and temple walls. But canals also served to unite Egypt, fostering a sense of shared identity and purpose. They became vital highways for trade, facilitating the free flow of goods, innovative ideas, and people between distant regions. The same water that nurtured the growth of wheat in the south also carried the heavy granite needed for the construction of magnificent pyramids in the north. The Nile's interconnected veins stitched the nation together, creating a cohesive whole. Each channel represented a powerful statement of intent, a testament to humanity's ability to cooperate harmoniously with nature rather than simply attempting to conquer it. Egypt's greatness did not arise from military conquest or the accumulation of vast quantities of gold. It flowed quietly in the meticulously maintained irrigation trenches, where the combined forces of sweat and sophisticated engineering transformed mere survival into a thriving civilization. Behind every towering monument, every bountiful harvest, and every precisely engineered floodgate stood a quiet, dedicated army of individuals, the engineers, the surveyors, and the scribes, who collectively transformed water into order and prosperity. They may not have been celebrated poets or fearsome warriors, but Egypt owed them everything. Without their unwavering dedication and expertise, the Nile's blessings would have either drowned the land in destructive floods or left it parched and starving. With their skills, it became the most productive and fertile river valley on earth. The Shaduf, a simple yet ingenious counterweighted lever, was one of their earliest and most impactful triumphs. With it, a single farmer could effortlessly lift buckets of water from the canal to the field, manually feeding crops when the floodwaters had receded. Later, the Sakia, a water wheel powered by oxen, amplified that effort, allowing for even greater efficiency. What began as back-breaking manual toil gradually evolved into a sophisticated mechanical rhythm. Egypt's first machines were born from necessity, not luxury, driven by the need to harness the river's power. But the true geniuses were the surveyors, revered as the rope stretchers. After every flood, when established boundaries vanished beneath the newly deposited silt, they carefully paced the fields with knotted cords, meticulously measuring anew. Their work was far from mere guesswork. It was precise geometry in action. Angles, distances, and proportions were the indispensable tools of empire. The knowledge they painstakingly gathered shaped not only the boundaries of the fields, but also the very foundations of the temples and tombs that dotted the landscape. From accurately measured water levels came the principles of symmetry, and from symmetry arose the foundations of Egyptian civilization. Then came the scribes, the meticulous record-keepers of the flood. They tracked water heights with nilometers, stone pillars marked with carved cubits, strategically stationed at temples like those in Elephantine and Philae. These sacred gauges transformed a natural event into quantifiable data, allowing for informed decision-making. When the water rose higher than expected, they issued warnings to the farmers, allowing them to take preventative measures. When it fell too low, they prepared for the possibility of famine, ensuring that resources were allocated effectively. The priests interpreted the numbers as divine messages, offering guidance and spiritual reassurance. But the engineers understood that they were simply reading the river's vital pulse. Even the pharaohs themselves relied heavily on these meticulous calculations. A misjudged flood could lead not only to widespread hunger, but also to dangerous revolt. The engineers, in this sense, were the unsung guardians of stability, ensuring the smooth functioning of Egyptian society. Their success was often invisible, their efforts taken for granted, but their failure could be catastrophic, plunging the kingdom into chaos. They may not have worn crowns or commanded armies, but they were the glue that held the kingdom together. Every brick used in the construction of the pyramids, every loaf of bread placed in the hands of a worker, began with their careful measurements and precise calculations. They bridged the gap between the divine realm of the gods and the mortal world of men, between the forces of chaos and the promise of control. Their mathematics flowed downstream, shaping the very structure of Egypt itself. In a world governed by divine order, they were the quiet priests of precision, the architects not of elaborate temples, but of the very fabric of life itself. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was not merely a river. It was a living god, worthy of reverence and worship. Its floods were perceived as divine moods, expressions of its power and benevolence. Its currents were seen as sacred speech, carrying messages of life and renewal. They called it Hapi, the bringer of abundance, the lord of fish and grain, the blue-skinned deity whose very body flowed through the veins of Egypt, sustaining all life. Every drop of water was considered a divine blessing, and every drought a sign of his silence or displeasure. When the annual flood arrived, priests led elaborate ceremonies at the riverbanks, offering bread, beer, and flowers that floated downstream, meant to please Hapi and coax him into continuing his generosity. In the grand temples of Thebes and Memphis, hymns were sung not to conquering heroes or powerful kings, but to the river that sustained them all, providing them with everything they needed. "You flood the fields," they chanted. "You give life to all that lives. You are the God of bread," expressing their profound gratitude and dependence. The flood was not viewed as a chaotic event. It was seen as divine order in motion, a tangible proof that Ma'at, the universal balance, still governed the world. If the waters rose too high or fell too low, it was interpreted as a warning sign that harmony had been disrupted and that something needed to be rectified. The pharaoh, as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, carried the sacred duty of maintaining that delicate balance, ensuring the well-being of his people and the stability of the kingdom. When the Nile failed to deliver, so too did the pharaoh's legitimacy, undermining his authority and threatening the established order. The river was far more than just water. It was a complex tapestry of politics, theology, and prophecy, intricately woven together. Yet, the Egyptians did not fear the Nile in the same way that others feared their gods, with a sense of distant awe. They revered it with a sense of familiarity, almost tenderness, viewing it as a benevolent provider rather than a capricious force of nature. They often depicted Hapi as neither male nor female, but as both, a symbol of fertility, round-bellied, and radiating generosity. He symbolized abundance without violence, creation without conquest. Even death was intimately tied to his life-giving gift. When the floodwaters receded, the rich black silt they left behind was called Kemet, meaning the black land. It was from this very word that Egypt derived its ancient name, a testament to the profound importance of the river's fertile deposits. Festivals marked the arrival of the inundation like the dawn of a new year, a time for celebration and renewal. Children danced joyfully in the streets. Farmers sang as they diligently repaired their dikes, and priests announced the rising waters with the rhythmic beat of drums and the fragrant scent of incense. For a few precious weeks, Egypt was united, not by a powerful ruler or a victorious war, but by the shared dependence on the life-giving water. The Nile's rhythm was not simply agricultural, it was spiritual architecture, shaping the very soul of the nation. Each rise and fall of the waters was perceived as a heartbeat in the body of a god, a divine pulse that sustained all life. And through that god, Egypt discovered a sense of immortality, a connection to something timeless and enduring. Empires would inevitably rise and crumble, but as long as Hapi faithfully returned each year, life and faith would inevitably begin anew, ensuring the continuation of their civilization. Every summer, as the Nile's floodwaters spread across the land, they carried a silent but invaluable gift, a fine layer of black silt. To the Egyptians, this was far more than mere mud. It was the very voice of the river, the language of creation itself. When the waters receded, they left behind a thin, glistening layer of life, rich with vital minerals carried from mountains far to the south. This black soil, known as Kemet, was the critical difference between a season of plentiful feasting and one of devastating famine, between a thriving civilization and a barren wasteland of sand. The farmers knew its texture by touch alone, able to discern its quality and potential with remarkable accuracy. A handful of Nile silt, smooth and dark, was considered more valuable than precious gold, for it held the promise of life. It nurtured the growth of wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus, everything needed to feed both the people and the ambitious empire. Each family had its own carefully marked plot, bordered by precisely constructed ridges of earth that trapped the floodwater, allowing it to soak deeply into the soil. Once the floodwaters receded, oxen plowed the damp fields, preparing the land for planting, and workers cast seeds into the gleaming mud, entrusting them to the fertile earth. Within a few short weeks, the land erupted into a vibrant green, a miracle so regular and reliable that it was viewed as nothing short of divine. Scribes meticulously recorded each year's yield, carefully comparing it to the height of the flood, noting any correlations or discrepancies. From these painstakingly collected notes, predictable patterns began to emerge. Low floods invariably meant thin harvests and rising grain prices, creating economic hardship. Generous floods, on the other hand, meant surplus and stability, ensuring a prosperous year. Over centuries, this quiet observation and careful documentation evolved into a sophisticated science, allowing for informed decision-making and strategic planning. Egyptian farmers didn't simply plant their crops. They forecasted, using their deep understanding of the land and the river to predict the likely outcome of each growing season. They learned to listen to the silt, to read its weight, its color, and its spread, gaining valuable insights into its properties and potential. The texture of the soil even shaped the layout and structure of Egypt's cities and villages. Settlements rose on higher ground to escape the unpredictable floods, while cultivated fields stretched in long, fertile ribbons along the riverbanks, maximizing access to the precious water and silt. The narrow green valley, hemmed in by the vast expanse of the desert, created a powerful sense of focus, a civilization perfectly balanced between the forces of chaos and the promise of order. Each year, the Nile effectively erased and redrew the landscape, forcing Egypt to adapt, to rebuild, and to remember the lessons of the past. In a way, the flood itself wrote the history of Egypt, shaping its culture, its economy, and its very identity. Temples and tombs were constructed of durable limestone, but the very foundation of Egypt's story was mud, wet, black, and eternal, a constant reminder of the river's vital role. Even the vibrant pigments used on their elaborate frescoes came from the same silt that nourished their crops, creating a tangible connection between art, agriculture, and the life-giving river. The Nile wasn't just feeding Egypt, it was painting it, giving it its unique character and distinctive beauty. When foreigners witnessed the river's remarkable bounty, they often envied its seemingly magical properties, attributing its fertility to some form of divine intervention. But to the Egyptians, there was nothing supernatural or mystical about it. It was simply a matter of skillful partnership, a collaborative relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. The Nile willingly gave its gifts, and the Egyptians in turn diligently listened, learning its secrets and adapting their lives accordingly. The silt was perceived as the handwriting of the gods, and the Egyptians learned to read it fluently year after year, extracting its wisdom and applying it to their daily lives. Controlling the Nile's generous gifts required more than just reverence and respect. It demanded unwavering precision and a deep understanding of engineering principles. The Egyptians transformed their worship into a form of practical engineering, transforming the natural flood into a carefully managed system of abundance. What began as simple canals gradually grew into a vast network of hydraulic machinery that stretched from the fertile delta to the distant reaches of Nubia. It was a living circuit where every strategically placed basin, every meticulously constructed dike, and every expertly dug channel played a vital role in Egypt's grand equation of survival and prosperity. At the very heart of this intricate system were the basin fields, vast rectangular enclosures carefully bordered by earthen embankments. When the floodwaters rose, the skillfully designed channels filled these basins in a carefully orchestrated sequence, ensuring an even distribution of water. The water lingered for several weeks, slowly soaking the soil and enriching it with precious nutrients before being drained into the next carefully prepared enclosure. The entire process mimicked the river's natural flow, but under precise human command, allowing for maximum control and efficiency. The result was controlled fertility, a man-made imitation of the Nile's natural pulse. Lifting water from the lower canals to the higher fields presented a significant challenge that required innovative solutions. The Shaduf, a counterbalanced lever with a bucket at one end and a weight at the other, revolutionized irrigation practices. With this simple yet ingenious device, a single farmer could effortlessly raise hundreds of liters of water a day from the canals to the higher terraces, ensuring that crops received the necessary moisture even when the floodwaters had receded. Later came the sakia, a wooden wheel turned by oxen, its strategically placed pots scooping and pouring water in an endless, rhythmic cycle. These devices were remarkably simple in their design, yet incredibly effective, powered by muscle and geometry, rather than relying on any form of magic. Every flood season required meticulous coordination on a national scale, demanding careful planning and efficient execution. Laborers diligently repaired dikes and dredged canals under the strict orders of local governors who, in turn, reported to the royal engineers in Memphis, the capital city. The pharaoh's decrees flowed downstream like the water itself, ensuring that every village along the river contributed to maintaining the delicate balance and maximizing the benefits of the flood. A breach in one province could potentially doom another hundreds of miles away, highlighting the interconnectedness of the system and the importance of collective responsibility. Even temples were integral parts of the system, serving as vital monitoring stations. Priests used carefully calibrated nilometers, vertical shafts with carved cubit marks, to meticulously measure water levels, recording the data for future analysis. From these readings, they could predict likely crop yields, estimate potential tax revenues, and assess the overall stability of the empire for the year ahead. Science, religion, and politics converged at the waterline, highlighting the complex interplay of forces that shaped Egyptian society. The Nile's machinery was not constructed of bronze or stone, but of something far more precious: people. Tens of thousands of individuals worked in perfect synchrony, guided by the river's tempo, their efforts coordinated to maximize the benefits of the flood. Egypt's true marvel wasn't a towering pyramid or a majestic sphinx, but this invisible infrastructure, a testament to a civilization built not to fight against nature, but to think and act like it, harmonizing with its rhythms. The flood was eternal, a constant cycle of renewal. But so too was the Egyptians' genius in mastering it, transforming a potential threat into a source of unparalleled prosperity. Long after the pharaohs were gone, and their grand temples swallowed by the shifting sands of time, the Nile continued its unwavering rhythm, a testament to its enduring power. The same flood that carried papyrus boats and golden barges in the time of Ramses still rose and fell centuries later, watched by farmers who no longer knew the names of the ancient gods, but still depended entirely on the river's life-giving mercy. Egypt's magnificent monuments weathered and crumbled, succumbing to the ravages of time. Yet its greatest creation, the harnessing of water, never ceased to function. The innovative techniques that once fed the builders of the pyramids became enduring templates for civilizations that followed, spreading across the ancient world and beyond. Greek engineers studied Egyptian canals, marveling at their efficiency and ingenuity. Roman surveyors borrowed their meticulously knotted measuring cords, adopting their precise methods. Medieval farmers across the Mediterranean basin used shadufs and sakia water wheels, virtually unchanged from their ancient prototypes, demonstrating their enduring practicality. Even the term nilometer survived as a concept long after its original readings were carved in cubits, a lasting legacy of Egyptian innovation. Egypt had transformed the simple act of irrigation into a sophisticated science, and the world never forgot the valuable lessons it taught. However, the Nile's power was always double-edged, capable of both creating and destroying. Too much control and the river withered, its natural flow stifled, and its life-giving properties diminished. Too little control and chaos inevitably returned, threatening the stability of the kingdom. Later rulers attempted to command the river in the same way that the pharaohs had, relying on bureaucracy instead of acknowledging the river's inherent divinity. But the delicate balance was easily disrupted, leading to unintended consequences. The British, centuries later, would build dams to regulate its floods, continuing a dialogue that had begun thousands of years before with simple baskets of mud and carefully constructed stone embankments. Even modern engineers in Cairo, studying satellite data and analyzing complex water flows, are the direct heirs to those ancient surveyors who measured with knotted ropes and navigated by the light of the stars. The true legacy of the Nile isn't found solely in its magnificent monuments or captivating myths. It's embedded in a unique mindset, a particular way of thinking about the world. The Egyptians learned early on that true mastery of nature doesn't come through brute conquest and domination, but through harmonious rhythm by working in partnership with its forces. They treated the flood not as a destructive enemy to be defeated, but as a powerful partner to be understood and respected. Their success was measured not in territorial conquests or the accumulation of wealth, but in continuity, in the ability to keep life flowing steadily, year after year, generation after generation. Every civilization dreams of achieving a sense of eternity, of leaving a lasting mark on the world. Egypt quietly achieved it through water, by understanding its power and harnessing its potential. The same patterns of canals, crops, and villages seen from the sky today mirror those meticulously etched into tomb walls over 3,000 years ago, a testament to the enduring nature of Egyptian civilization. The Nile still flows north, carrying its precious cargo of silt and water, still leaving its indelible mark on the landscape in shadow and light, and still murmuring the same ancient promise: "Follow my rhythm, and I will make you eternal," offering a timeless path to lasting legacy. In the end, Egypt's greatest monument wasn't carved from stone by the hands of skilled artisans. It was expertly engineered from the river itself, a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring power of nature.